A very warm welcome to everybody who is joining us for this webinar hosted by Community Legal Centres Queensland on disability, disasters and law. My name is Monica Taylor and I am leading the climate and disaster resilience work here at Community Legal Centres Queensland. To begin with, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm dialing in and joining you all from, in Meanjin, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and I wish to pay my deepest respect to their elders past and present and acknowledge that we are on stolen lands and that sovereignty was never ceded. As this webinar is being viewed by people all throughout Queensland and Australia, I also pay respect to the traditional owners of the land that you're dialing in from today and extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people in the audience. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, given that we are talking about the climate crisis and disasters, it's important to recognise that the climate crisis we are living through is another ongoing legacy of colonisation and a problem not of their making. So today we have three great presenters who are going to talk to us about disability, disasters and law, and we will start with Queenslanders with Disabilities Network. So I'd like to welcome Helen Stiles, who is the project lead for Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction. That's DIDRR. It's a new acronym that you can add to your suitcase of acronyms in the sector. And Nadia Brady, who is peer leader with Queenslanders with Disabilities Network. And after Helen and Nadia, we'll hear from Matilda Alexander, CEO of Queenslanders for Advocacy for Inclusion, who will talk about the legal dimensions of disasters for people with disability. Just some housekeeping before we kick off. There is an ability to ask questions of our presenters, and you can use the questions tab on the GoToWebinar panel. I will see those questions, and then at the end of our presentation, I can pass those questions on to our presenters. And we'll hopefully have about 10 minutes at the end of the session for that. But I'm now going to hand over to Helen to take things away.
Thank you so much, Monica. Thank you for having us. It's our pleasure today to talk to you about person-centred emergency preparedness. I hope everyone can see the screen that we're sharing there. Could I get a thumbs up if people can see the screen? Yes, thank you, Nadia. Person-centred emergency preparedness is a way for people with disability to get ready for disaster. And Nadia and I are going to talk about that with you today. I'm actually going to hand over to Nadia to kick us off.
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever we talk about disasters, we start by talking about making sure that you get support for your mental health. If you find that after we talk about this, anything's staying with you. And I think that's important for people working in this space also. So you can call Lifeline or Beyond Blue. You can visit your GP to get a mental health care plan. Probably a lot of you working in this space have an EAP. You can have a chat to a friend. There's no wrong way to reach out, but if you do need to reach out because it can be difficult talking about disaster. So who are Queenslanders with Disability Network? We're an organisation of, by and for people with disability. So our motto is nothing about us without us. So we're a statewide network with over 2,000 members, and we're really driven by what people with disability want. We have this work in the disability space, which has really been driven and designed by people with disability. We've got peer groups, peer support groups of people with disability that are place-based across the state, and yeah, heaps of amazing stuff happening. So this slide is just talking about how the work in disability inclusive disaster risk reduction has really been driven by people with disability. So these are photos of some of our peer leaders and some of the work we've done. And I think it's important to talk about how I don't think some of the work we've done would be the same if it hadn't been driven by people with disability. So yesterday I was doing some work with a new peer leader who I've mentored. So I was sitting in the room and helping her to run a workshop that she was basically doing herself because she's so confident and she's so amazing. And really the mentoring I've given her is quite like, it's been very gentle, but her confidence now is so amazing. And as I was mentoring her, I could see that people in the room, she was mentoring them and creating this leadership. So not only are people in that room going away with an emergency plan, but they're really ready to take up that call and help other people create their emergency plans. And I think seeing that leadership, it creates a sense of I can do this. Like I feel like I can create an emergency plan, but like I feel very in control of my own life. Like it takes away a lot of that sense of limitation. Helen, should I read the quote here, or do you think I've summed that up enough?
I think you've summed it up beautifully, but what I really love about what you've just been talking about and the P-CEP approach is it does start from a strengths-based approach. It's about recognising that people with disability are the experts in their lives and need to tell us as practitioners in this space, whether we are community organisations or emergency managers or government, what they need in emergencies and to help make that happen. And I think that's what I really love about the quote that you have here, Nadia, is that you have unlocked a strength in yourself to not only prepare yourself, but to help other people prepare for emergencies, which is fantastic. And we should always recognise that people with disability do face higher risk in disaster. There is evidence that people with disability are 2 to 4 times more likely to be injured or killed in a disaster, that they're more likely to live in housing that would be affected in flooding, that their ability to access information, emergency warnings can be hindered when that emergency information is not delivered in formats that they can access. So I think the thing that I want to impress upon people here is that the risk is not risk that's inherent in the individual, it's risk that exists in the systems and the structures that we've created in our community, and it's up to all of us to have a role to play in reducing that disaster risk. The person-centred emergency preparedness has 3 key components that helps to centre the planning and the preparedness around the individual, that it starts with them. And we start with a capability wheel, which we're actually going to show you and unpack a little bit for you in a minute, but it's where we start so that people can tailor their emergency preparedness. Nadia, could you talk about the 3 principles?
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, emergency preparedness is a process, not a one-time event. We don't expect people to come into a room and to leave being absolutely prepared for every contingency. If you can have a conversation and go away being a little more prepared, having thought about one thing and taken one action, or even thought about taking one action, that's amazing. Really, none of us are ever going to be 100% prepared, and thinking about it in that way takes away the sense of it being so overwhelming. The next principle is that people are experts in their lives and planning starts with them. You really have to consider that there's so much that you don't know, and when you listen to people, you learn. I think so. I'll really briefly. In a workshop we did, someone talked about what would happen if her goldfish got left behind, and a person supporting us to run the workshop said, "Oh, you just have to leave them behind." And what we learned is the goldfish was the most important thing in that person's life. So she's the expert in her life. The goldfish is important to her. You have to sit and listen. And then person-centered planning.
And I suppose the hot tip on that one is you can evacuate a goldfish in Tupperware. Use some Glad wrap over it, with a rubber band and some holes so it can breathe, but it is doable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when we took a deep breath and sat with that and listened to her as an expert in her own experience, we were like, it's a solvable problem. You know, every problem has a solution. But if you think about it as someone like me, if I had goldfish, I'd go, okay, well, that's sad, but oh well. But for this person, it wasn't a that's sad, but oh well. It was that's the thing that's going to lead to her not evacuating and having a poorer outcome. And so she's the expert in her own life. We have to listen to her and sit with her and take the time. And that's the solution that one of our peer leaders came up with. How do we come up with the solution? Which I suppose leads to number 3, person-centered planning conversations build capability of multiple stakeholders towards disability-inclusive disaster risk reductions, which to me, it's about those quality conversations with everyone involved. So people with disability at the centre, but all stakeholders, the whole community, leading to that quality of disability inclusive disaster risk reduction.
And finally, the third principle is that there are 4 steps, or third component, I should say, of the P-CEP is that there are 4 steps. We work through the steps sequentially, and I want to point out something here. When you look at what is often out there about how to get ready for emergencies, the kind of information that emergency services or local government might put out, they'll often start there at step 2. You need to know your risk, and then you need to go and make a plan. What the research tells us, and here's where we should of course acknowledge our wonderful colleague, Associate Professor Michelle Villeneuve from the University of Sydney, who is the researcher who has led the development of the P-CEP and the driving force behind so much of this work. She recognised that very early on, that starting with the risk and the hazards starts from a scary place. So we bring in step 1 in the first instance to start from a place of strength. Who are you every day? What are your support needs and your strengths every day? Now that you know and recognise that and can articulate them, now let's learn about your risk. Okay, now we understand something about what can happen in an emergency where you live. What would happen around your support needs and how would you plan for that? So we build the plan from a place of strength, starting with what the person knows and then bringing in the information about risks and hazards. I think what we should do next, Nadia, is move to the capability wheel, because that will help us show step 4 in a really nice way. So this is when we put it all together. So here are the 4 steps, moving around in a clockwise direction around these 8 areas of capability. Now, if you know anything about occupational therapy, you will recognise these as the domains for everyday living. We have worked with the University of Sydney now for several years with lots of research and looked at how this applies to people with disability. There's some work around seniors, there's some work around people experiencing homelessness that has happened, and found that these same 8 domains work for all of these different populations. And what we do when we unpack the P-CEP with people through one of our workshops or through using the workbook such as this, which is a free download, and you'll get a link to that at the end of the workshop, is it helps people move through these 8 areas and ask some key questions to help identify what needs look like every day, so that when you overlay what an emergency would do to change the situation, how would you then manage those needs? And we do this in a conversational way with people, and anyone can do this. Nadia, I thought we might demonstrate a little bit to show people, to tell people a little bit about animals, because animals are what, as we've already heard with the goldfish, can actually be the difference between people evacuating or not. So it is essential to start with animals, and people love planning for their animals. So let's start from there. Nadia, could you tell us about your furry friend in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a little dog called Bagel. His full name's Poppy Seed Bagel. He's a Maltese Pomeranian Shih Tzu. He goes to daycare every Friday. He sleeps on my bed. He gets like a lot of treats. We go to a place called a barkery to get his treats. He's like my best friend. We, have a birthday party for him every year. It was my birthday on the weekend, and I got 3 birthday presents that had his face on them. So yeah, he's just like my absolute, like my little son,
Nadia, thank you for sharing that. Could you tell us a little bit about where you live and your living situation, which is just next to Assistance Animals here on the capability wheel?
Yeah, absolutely. So I live with my parents we live in a house in South Toowoomba. We're quite close to each other. So, we spend a lot of time together. We support each other. Yeah.
What kind of hazards happen where you live, Nadia? What kind of disaster events have you experienced there in Toowoomba?
Well, heat waves seem to be happening a bit more. There was the inland tsunami that's going back over a decade now, but that was a little bit unexpected. Bushfires, not coming into the city, but the smoke does, is something that impacts, as well as, being cut off. Those are the major ones.
Great. We've already moved through the first 2 steps of the P-CEP, well, just with 2 domains there, animals and living situation. Nadia, when we talk about step 3 of the P-CEP, we talk about planning for support needs, and we ask people to think about 2 scenarios. We try and distill it down to, what would you do if you had to shelter in place for a long time and couldn't leave your house because the danger was outside your house? COVID is a really good example of sheltering in place. And then we ask people to consider what they would need to do if they had to evacuate. And sometimes the decision to evacuate is not a decision that we get to make. Sometimes it can be an ordered evacuation from authorities like the police. If you had to evacuate, how would you manage Bagel and Bagel's needs in an evacuation?
So I've actually put together a little go bag for Bagel that has hopefully everything he needs. It has a bag of food for him, a bag of treats, a lead in a plastic bag, so it should be pretty safe from the elements, information about him, his vaccinations, all of his needs. What else does it have? It has a little high-vis bandana, so that if it's smoky, he should stand out. Every time I see something and go, oh, that should go in there, I add it. So it has a seat belt now, a little doggy seat belt, because I realized that wasn't there. So it started out just having a photo of him, his food and his treats, and everything else I've just slowly added to it.
So one of the things I love about what's in Bagel's Go Bag is that it includes you've told me about this sheet about how to care for Bagel if somebody else had to care for Bagel. And I just love that idea. I feel like every one of us could have our own sheet in our Go Bag that says, if you meet me and I'm in an evacuation centre or somewhere where you would hope to not have to meet people, but let's plan for it just in case. If you met me, here are the support needs that I have and how you can support me. These are conversations we typically have with people, particularly people with communication challenges, people who are deaf, say, who will not be able to rely on having a wonderful Auslan interpreter like Cornelia that we have today at the ready in an evac centre, that they would have a piece of paper that helps people understand how they would communicate with them. Let's look at step 4 then of the P-CEP, because we're moving so readily through this. Step 4 is, so you've come up with a great plan. Who in your life needs to know about this plan so that they know what you're planning to do and can support you if needed? Who else knows about Bagel's support plan?
Well, because I feel like quite happy about it and it's quite organised, it's a lot easier to communicate. So Bagel's backpack is actually a little bluey backpack that I picked up at the op shop that sits on my cupboard door. So most people who come into the house go, oh, that's a cute backpack. And I say it's Bagel's Go Bag. But certainly all of my family, including family who visit, know that it's Bagel's Go Bag. So if I wasn't there, they'd still know that it was there, and they know what's in it. Part of it, the reason that they know what's in it is because when we run out of Bagel's normal food, we just go to his Go Bag, but then the next day we go and get him more food, which sounds like, it sounds a bit like it's not the best thing, but it actually is good because it means it's not just gathering dust somewhere. But then I talk to people about it because it's something I care about a lot. So especially because I like talking about Bagel, but I talk about emergency preparedness to people in the community. So not necessarily like, here's how you care for Bagel, but I talk about their pets and I ask, do you have an emergency plan? So it's a different sort of conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I love that so many people know about Bagel and Bagel's Go Bag. Why it's so important to communicate this is that for so many reasons, but one of the things that I wanted to impress upon our audience here is we know that people who are in the support networks that surround people with disability, that they might be friends, family, neighbours, or support workers, can put themselves in danger in order to support someone in a way in which they could have been avoided when you have all of these conversations when the sun is shining and there's no smoke in the air. I live in cyclone country, so a lot of my experience up in North Queensland is in cyclones, and I can tell you of so many near misses of support workers who have put themselves in danger, jumping in their cars and driving across town in the eye of a cyclone when it's calm to go and check on somebody they were worried about because they didn't know what the plan was that person had to stay safe and well in emergencies. Step 4 is so critical for that. And the other big word, the other C word that I want to point out to people here is the word collaboration there in step 4. There will be, or there often is, gaps in people's plans. There'll be issues around the common things are transport and communication. So transport, I know where I'm going to go to evacuate, but I can't get there myself because there isn't appropriate public transport in my community, or because I'm not sure how reliable it would be in an emergency, for example. that's where a community of people need to rally around an individual to support them in coming up with a plan that can address that gap. And sometimes that means taking that conversation beyond them to broader community. So one thing that we're doing in communities right now, I can think of some work that we're doing right now in the Somerset region, where that community has recognised that lack of transport is so critical on a daily basis for people with disability to get to the doctors or the shops. The thing about disasters is that they exacerbate existing gaps in our community, and that is an existing gap in that community that they've recognised. So they are working towards a community transport solution there that will help people every day and critically in emergencies. Could we just talk very briefly, because then we must hand over to Matilda, about the role that we think community legal services can take in this space? The first comment there is put your oxygen mask on first. Remember when we're in the plane and the flight attendants tell us that you need to put your oxygen mask on first before you can help other people with theirs. We say the same thing in emergency preparedness. If we want to enable emergency preparedness in other people, we need to be prepared ourselves, because we can't be there for them in an emergency if we aren't already prepared ourselves. But the role that community legal centres can take is a lot of the kinds of things they can do to help people with disability get connected to this information and resources. Nadia, could I hand over to you to tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, could you just...
We're talking about how to be a conversation starter with P-CEP.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think if you look at the conversations that Helen and I are having, I would be, if you just gave me this content today, I would be a little bit lost. You know, it can be really, really daunting. And I think probably like of a lot of people sitting here, you might not have an emergency plan yourself. If you went away today and your job for the rest of the day was just to go through those 8 steps and come up with an emergency plan, it's way too much, right? But if your job was to go and over lunch sit and have a yarn with a mate about emergency preparedness, it becomes less overwhelming. So to be someone who can listen openly, it helps things a lot. And I am sure that a lot of you have many of those skills to help the conversation get going and open people up to thinking about things they may not otherwise think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And being that other voice, fresh ears and eyes to bounce off can be so critical. Community legal centres can point people in the right direction towards the P-CEP tools. There's a link here on the slides that you're going to get to Michelle Villeneuve's website, Collaborating for Inclusion, and on the next slide there's links to QDM's website with our resources as well. Those resources are all free to download. And just finally, I think this is a critical piece. This is that step 4 piece about collaborating to address gaps. That I think there is a role for community legal centres to help people with disability become connected to other people who might be interested in working with them in advocacy, other people who might have the kind of resources or problem-solving skills that they might need to help work through the challenges. And sometimes it can just be, like we were saying before, being another set of eyes and ears. And I'll be really keen to explore that a little bit further in our question time with our audience to hear what they're thinking about that. So that's the workbook that we're holding up before. and as I said, they are inclusive disaster risk reduction. Please give us a call. Please shout out. We're always here and happy to help. Thank you very much. And we'll hand over to Matilda.
Thank you so much, Helen and Nadia. That was wonderful. I'm just changing presenter so that Matilda can share her screen. You really brought P-CEP to life. Goldfish, bagel, just so much fun and colour to a toolkit that can really make a massive difference for people. Hopefully, Matilda. Yes, wonderful. There we go. Thank you so much.
You can see my screen? Yeah.
Yep, can see it perfectly.
Hello, everyone. My name's Matilda. I'm the CEO of Queensland Advocacy for Inclusion. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people of the Jagera and Turrbal people of whom land I'm on, and pay our respects to First Nations Australians, and in particular to First Nations Australians with disability, and acknowledging the intersectional disadvantage they experience. I pay my respect to First Nations elders, and in particular First Nations elders with disability, and in particular our President Byron Albury. So QAI is an advocacy organisation and specialist community legal centre for people with disability. We have previously received specific funding to work with people with disability around disasters and in following COVID and the floods. So part of that was to put together this resource on disasters, disability and the law, which I'll be talking further about today. And disasters can take a range of different forms, which QDN has covered and talked about. So storms, floods, cyclones, air pollution, and most notably this summer we've seen a lot of heat waves, and we've been doing some work going out to supported accommodation, so the kind of boarding houses where a lot of people with disability are accommodated, and heat waves in particular was one of the key issues that we've seen recently. So disasters can lead to a variety of different legal problems for people with disability: housing, employment, social security, credit, bankruptcy and insurance matters. And we've also seen family law, and in particular domestic violence, arising from disasters. There was an ABC article after the floods that really told the story of many people with disability who had experienced a lack of service delivery key supports during the period of the floods. They were trapped in accommodation, trapped without supports, and there was a range of different terrible effects. And these effects didn't recede with the receding floodwaters. These effects were felt many months after. So this study from Lismore shows that people with disabilities and their support workers are more likely to have their houses flooded and be displaced 6 months after the flood event, and a greater incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. Brendan's one of our management committee members, and he's given consent for us to use this as a case study. So when the building that he lives in was flooded, he was left alone and forgotten about. The lift and the intercom were not working, and the entrance points of his building had changed without his knowledge. He was not told of the evacuation policies and procedures and didn't know what to do in an emergency. So he lives in a community housing provider, and he said that the dozens of other people with disability in the building didn't have adequate emergency plans in place, and he's still fighting for those plans. Another case study from during the flood was a woman with a reduced mobility who relied on the lift to access her inner city apartment. She was unable to use stairs and during the flood, she was trapped in her unit, and for months after the flood, then she was unable to return to the unit and she had to keep paying rent despite the fact that it was inaccessible. So these are the kind of they're practical issues that the QDN resource can plan for and prepare for, but they're also legal issues that we as community lawyers can address. So our booklet, Natural Disasters, Disability and the Law, and fact sheet cover a range of different legal problems, and these are just a sample. So, for example, family law, domestic violence is often an issue, but we haven't covered that in this booklet. So it's just some of the key ones that we practice in and specialise in. It looks at discrimination law and human rights law, NDIS law, duty of care, properties and tenancies, insurance, criminal law, government and police powers, some stuff around developing inclusive emergency response plans and access to evacuation and other services. So I'm going to go over a couple of those briefly today, but please do go to the resource if you'd like some more information. So some examples of disability discrimination might be denying a person with disability a safe and suitable evacuation plan, providing inaccessible evacuation information, so like a warning sign that people who are deaf in the building aren't able to hear, a warning, evacuation message. Safe and suitable accommodation, access to services, and access to supports for the assistance animal. So might be something, there's a number of different examples we've got in the booklet. So things like if attending a evacuation centre and being denied access because you have a assistance animal, or being told you have to leave the assistance animal outside. And if somebody comes up with a P-CEP that really works for them and is accessible, and then being denied being able to use that or implement that. And also making sure accommodation is accessible after a natural disaster. There are a number of human rights that are applicable, and it's important to note that NDIS service providers, registered providers, are human rights public entities under the Queensland Human Rights Act. So a service provider who fails to do enough planning around a disaster may face a discrimination or a human rights complaint, or a combination of the two. And the relevant rights would be things like the right to life, freedom of expression, the right to equality, freedom of movement, health services, and property. These are all human rights that are protected in Queensland. So the NDIS, and not all people with disability have access to the NDIS, but for many people it is the really key thing to think about in terms of preparing for disasters and making sure the supports are in place. So all NDIS registered providers should have emergency plans in place, and NDIS service providers have to ensure you have access to those supports at times of disasters. They have to think about this. It's not just a personal responsibility to plan. The provider also needs to have a plan. They need to provide training to their workers to implement the plan and give you information about the plan that they've come up with, and review and update those plans. The NDIS will also provide urgent funding for assistive technology repair, even if you have no funds left in your plan. There's also an aspect of the NDIS that can be taken into account in planning for emergencies. And one example of that is there is some some case law, like the case of Mackenzie and the NDIA, a 2019 case that found that air conditioners can be funded by the NDIS. And that was a case of somebody with multiple sclerosis, which is a condition that means you have more difficulty in self-regulating heat. So, for example, in a heat wave, somebody with MS would need to have an air conditioner, and that might be part of emergency planning in that instance. So yeah, certainly there are a number of different community legal centres that are practising in NDIS law, and it would be worth being conscious of these things as part of emergency planning. In relation to duty of care, so duty of care is owed by somebody in a position of power, might be a doctor or a landlord, and in those instances, that duty of care may include the duty to plan for and be prepared for natural disasters, because they are, it's really reasonably foreseeable, particularly things like, we're in Queensland. If you're not reasonably foreseeing that we're going to have some more heat waves, then you're just not paying attention. So this duty is anyone who is providing goods and services as well, or people that you rely on for for help because of the specialist skills they've got, like doctors. Now, an action in negligence. Many CLCs don't practice in this, but we should be aware of it to make referrals and link people up with supports. So so if somebody owes you a duty of care and doesn't take reasonable care in the course of their interactions with you, which means that you suffer some kind of loss or injury or damage, then that's what negligence is. So you need to have a duty of care owed. A failure, the person who owes that duty fails to do something, and it's not reasonable for them to have that failing, and you've suffered harm as a result. So given all of the duties on, say, NDIS service providers around natural disasters, it could well be not reasonable for them not to have a plan in place, and to for somebody with disability to have been left without supports for a period of time, such as a flood, as was highlighted in that case, that this is the ABC article that I showed before. So some examples of NDIS of providers, so support workers and organisations are prepared. What they're required to do to fulfil the duty of care would be to deliver care to you that's safe and doesn't put you at risk of further harm, to ensure that you have sufficient support, and notify the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission if it's not possible for them to deliver those supports that you're entitled to. And they must have processes in place to ensure that support workers they send to care for you are not putting you at a risk of harm. And there is the NDIS, the National Disability Abuse and Neglect Hotline to call in those instances if you do think that there's some negligence going on there, as well as talking to lawyers. So tenancy law, and while not every CLC will practice in all of these areas of law, it's really good to get a broad overview. This resource aims to give a broad overview of a number of different areas of law, so at least you can be alert to them and point people in the right direction. So tenancy law, and tenancy law here is not just what's in the Residential Tenancy Act. It's also looking across different pieces of law, like discrimination law. So yeah, so it would be discriminatory, for example, to refuse you access to or use of a property or facility that's open to the public because of your disability, or leave the property or stop using the facility because of your disability. So alterations to accommodation should be allowed if you are able to pay for them and return the property back to the original conditions. So that might include alterations to the evacuation system to ensure that a auditory evacuation alarm also has, say, a flashing light or some other means of vibrating thing to mean that you can be alerted in times of emergencies. So adjustments and modifications in that instance should be allowed. It's also discrimination to refuse to rent accommodation to someone because they have a disability and rely on an assistance animal, or to require you to keep your assistance animal elsewhere, or to pay an extra charge because of the assistance animal. But you would still be required, obviously, to pay for damage caused by an assistance animal. And you can notify your landlord if you're leaving because your accommodations become unfit due to the natural disaster. In relation to insurance, you might be able to claim certain types of damage with your insurance provider during or following a natural disaster. And that might also be your landlord might have insurance that covers your damage as well. Even if you're not, the insurance isn't in your name, it's still worth asking the questions. So it might include damage to property, damage to mobility equipment, including wheelchairs, and noting as well there's that provision for under NDIS to claim to get assistance to get technology paid for by the NDIS in cases of emergency. So you might have multiple avenues to explore there. Insurance might also cover costs associated with vet bills for assistance animals. There are some instances where insurers can discriminate against people with disability, where there is data to back up that it's going to cost them more to insure the person with disability. But it's always worth getting some advice if you think you've been unfairly discriminated against. So that discrimination should never be unfair. There are a number of different ways that criminal law can impact on, and policing can impact on a disaster scenario. And you might see more police. Police might be able to have additional powers at times of disaster, and that declaration. So a declaration of disaster can mean special powers to the police, and it has to be connected. They have to declare the disaster because it's going to save lives or prevent injury or illness or property damage or damage to the environment. That's the kind of criteria for that declaration of disaster. And we saw that during COVID, most notably, the declaration of disaster with additional policing powers. And again, just that can lead to a range of different problems, and CLCs are well placed to provide advice to people with disability around those problems, such as, evidencing disability for the exemptions for the during COVID. So we've got a range of different things, including so there's all the ones at QDN. So I didn't replicate those here, but we always work with QDN and we're close allies. We think they're the best resources, but these are just a few other extra ones, including at the end there, our resource. Yeah, so that's all that I had, and I'll hand over to Monica now for questions.
Thank you so much, Matilda. That was fantastic. If you can stop sharing screen, we'll get Helen and Nadia back as well. And we have just a little bit of time left for questions. So please, if you have a question, you can pop it in the question box and I can ask it. One has come through for you, Helen and Nadia, to talk about whether the P-CEP model is creating change in the disaster management space. And so whether you have any comments about, I guess, the bubbling up of change you might be seeing with disaster management, police, ambulance, and so forth.
It's huge. The change it's like this growing movement that is happening, and so much of the change happens simply because you've helped raise awareness about something that a lot of people might not have recognised. So one of the things that we do in this work, especially when it's led by our wonderful peer leaders like Nadia, is is help open the eyes of emergency services and people in government working in emergency management to the everyday needs of people with disability in emergencies. And sometimes that can mean having some devastating conversations. We have a peer leader based in Townsville. Peter has MS, and Peter says, if your evacuation centre cannot accommodate me, you aren't planning to save me. Now that line is like a kick in the gut for emergency services colleagues and councils, but they take it on board because they recognise, oh wait, there was something we weren't considering in our planning. But what they then learn is that when you make spaces, and sometimes those are online spaces with things like information and warnings, when they're accessible to people with disability, they're accessible to everyone. So starting from a position of thinking about the needs of the people who have the maybe more struggle to access that information actually makes that easier for everyone to be able to access those spaces and that information. Nadia, would you agree that we're seeing that change happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that shift from a sense of fatigue and perhaps grief in those emergency spaces. It's not that they don't care about us as people with disability. It's that there's almost a sense of resignation that there's some people that you just can't help. And then like as people with disability, we sit there and we have conversations until we find the solutions, and then we're trying to bring people, community in and find those solutions, and it brings that sense of hope that actually, like, we can figure it out. It might take us like a few cups of coffee, you know, like we might run out of tea and bickies, but we'll get there. And it reinvigorates that sense of hope from, like, I think our emergency services are you know, they're very fatigued, and they've seen a lot of poor outcomes. But when there are solutions that we're coming up with, and also people who are, you know, coming into the space determined to create our own solutions, we're not going fix this for us. We're coming in there wanting to have conversations and wanting to come up with some ideas ourselves. And I think that's something I've seen a real great appreciation for, that they really like, that proactiveness.
And I really must mention there are a new set of national principles and standards currently being developed for disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. So the National Emergency Management Agency has engaged Michelle Villeneuve and the research team at the University of Sydney. We are expecting those to be delivered in the middle of this year, and it will include a toolkit for people to be able to use to increase that inclusion of people with disability in disaster management in their jurisdiction.
Thank you, Helen. That's really great information for our audience to know about. There's a question for you, Matilda. In fact, there are two, and so this might be where we close things off. The first is someone is keen to know the negligence hotline number that you referenced. I think that's in relation to the NDIA. And then secondly, so great to have a list of all these general areas of civil law that community legal centres practice in, and it really reinforces how much preparation community legal centres can do rather than waiting until after the disaster. And so if of all the areas of law that you touched on, some areas that might be particularly amenable to prevention and preparedness work, if you've got any comments on that.
Yeah, so the hotline, is it best to put it in the chat, or I mean the number is 1800 880 052. Yeah, so it's the National Disability Abuse and Neglect Hotline, for free, independent and confidential. So it's really important that we're starting to collect these stories and talk about them. I mean, the Disability Royal Commission looked at these kind of issues as well and really identified that as being disasters, as being a risk for people with disability. Yeah, what was the second part of the question again?
Yeah, it was a long one, sorry. Of all those areas of law, in your opinion, which ones are particularly amenable to prevention work rather than disaster recovery? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, disability and discrimination law, are really key. So discrimination law and also tenancy law, so the intersection of those two. So if you're preparing a P-CEP, it's you're going to have to be talking with your land creature, whoever that might be, and your landlord or and making sure that that P-CEP is accepted and really works. So that was the example that we had of Brendan in our presentation, where he's got great ideas and having some difficulty implementing those. So so it's just about making sure, you know, that because discrimination law can be really powerful there, but so can tenancy law. And of course, people with disabilities are in a range of different housing situations, from owning their own houses to being in community housing to being in government housing or private tenancy arrangements. So there's a range of different legal things behind making a P-CEP work. And most of the time the P-CEP won't need a lawyer, but a lawyer can be really handy if you are facing some kind of problems with getting people on board with it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, we've come to the end of the hour, so I'm going to close things off. Massive thank you and cheers to Helen, Matilda and Nadia for your fantastic presentations, and to Cornelia for your wonderful Auslan interpreting. Thank you so much. Well done, everybody, for your great questions in the audience. Please fill in the survey afterwards so that we can track feedback on these sorts of webinars. But otherwise, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.